Okay, so I'm going to need to do it on here because I need to record this today. Hang on a second. So, what are some of the costs that you guys came up with? Potatoes. What kind of potatoes? So I'm just going to make this whole thing easier, I think they said Snowden potatoes, which I don't even know what those are. So this is going to matter in a minute. So I'm going to put Snowden potatoes, okay? What else?
We've got machinery, which is the seasoners, the ovens, thingies, and the air belts.
There's a lot of machinery, right?
Yeah, I just put PPE to be honest.
Yeah, then that's, I'm just going to put machinery, so that's totally, because there's a lot. Yeah. Transportation.
And that's both of the raw materials and the exports.
Right, incoming and outgoing, yep.
Labor, seasonings that they put on.
Seasonings, what kind of seasoning? Do you remember what they were making? Perfect. What else did I hear? I'm sorry.
Labor.
What kind of labor?
Yeah, it's manual labor.
Okay, so we had we saw people actually touching the product, right? So I'm going to put assembly line people. That's line. Workers. Yeah.
The cost of oil that they find.
Oil. So just to make this easier again, I'm going to say peanut oil. We don't know what kind. I don't know what kind. Could be canola. I don't know.
Put under raw material. I think,
Well, it's going to make a difference here in a second. But
could we throw R&D on there?
did you see R&D going on?
I saw a lot of R&D. You said like 17.
That is true that they did develop
There was some
stuff.
serious labor.
Okay, we're just going to ignore that for now because you're making it way more complicated than I want it to be right now. But thank you. That's a good point. Yes, utilities, electricity, good. Right? Okay. So these are our costs, right? No? Mm-mm. Yeah, what? Packaging. Okay, so these are the costs that we observed. We know that there's more. And then over here, I'm going to put barbecue chips. Okay. And I also know that this brand, this company makes, no, it's something Better Made, which I've never heard of, but I think it's salt and vinegar is another type that they make. And then over here, I'm also going to write just chip factory. Okay. So, a cost object is anything that we want to know the cost for, okay? So we want to know, and they use cases, right? So if we want to know what the cost of a case of barbecue chips is, then that's our cost object. If we want to know what the case of salt and vinegar chips cost, then that's our cost object, right? If we want to know what all of the costs are associated with the chip factory, then the chip factory is our cost object. So you can pick whatever cost object you want. Right? We could pick this classroom. We could pick that chair. We could pick the whole university. You can pick anything you want, right? And so you're going to analyze your costs relative to whatever cost object you choose, okay? So they didn't talk about salt and vinegar chips, but I'm just going to let you know, let's say that for salt and vinegar chips, they use, I'm going to say Yukon potatoes. And salt and vinegar seasoning. Okay. So if we look at barbecue chips as our cost object, right? To figure out how much we want to price it at, we're not just going to add up the potatoes and the oil, right, and the seasoning. We have to add in some portion of all this other stuff, right? Otherwise, we won't make any money. So the question is how we do that. But first, we want to identify which of these costs are direct costs to the cost object. And a direct cost means that it's caused by the cost object. Okay? So a direct cost is caused by the cost object. Okay. Meaning that if we didn't have that particular cost object, we wouldn't have that cost. Okay, so they're directly linked. Okay. An indirect cost is something that's shared among the cost objects. Okay. So for example, Snowden potatoes, is that a direct or indirect cost of the barbecue chips, right? Okay, so are Snowden potatoes a direct, indirect, or not a cost of the salt and vinegar chips?
Not a cost.
Right, it's not related because we said Yukon potatoes were used, right? How about, are Snowden potatoes a direct or indirect cost of the chip factory? Let me just write here direct so you know what I'm saying. Okay, so if I got rid of the chip factory, would I have a Snowden potato cost? No, if I don't have a chip factory, there's no potatoes. So it's a direct cost, right? The chip factory, if I'm looking at the chip factory, I want to know all of the costs associated with the chip factory. Does that make sense? So if I didn't have the chip factory, I wouldn't have potatoes. You'll see what indirect is in a second. So Snowden potatoes are direct cost of the barbecue chips and of the chip factory, okay? What about the barbecue seasoning? How is that related to the barbecue chips? Direct. How about to the salt and vinegar chips? Not. And to the chip factory. If I got rid of the chip factory, would I have a barbecue seasoning cost? No, so it's caused by, does that make sense? I only have a barbecue seasoning cost if I have the factory. Okay. How about the peanut oil? Direct. Direct, right? We're just going to assume a different kind of oil goes to, we're going to say that other chips use a whole different type of oil. Okay, so this is where you're going to hopefully understand indirect. So machinery, if I got rid of the barbecue chips, would I still have a machinery cost? So then is it direct or indirect? Indirect, right? It's shared between both of these. Okay, it's a shared cost for both of our products. So this is an indirect cost for our barbecue chips. And what is it for our salt and vinegar? Also indirect. Right. So with regard to the chip factory, is it direct or indirect? Direct, right? If I didn't have the chip factory, I wouldn't have machinery. Okay. I'm going to skip assembly line workers for a minute. How about utilities? Right, same kind of thing, right? Even if I stop making the chips, I'm still going to have utility. Or even if I stop making barbecue chips, I'm still going to have utilities. How about for salt and vinegar? Indirect, right? Right. Transportation. It's the same, right? Indirect, indirect, direct. We're going to come down here to these bottom two. So the Yukon potatoes and the salt and vinegar seasoning. How do they relate to barbecue chips? Huh? How about salt and vinegar chips? What about the chip factory? Okay, so we're up to packaging, okay? We're going to package them separately, right? They're going to have different kinds of labels. One will say salt and vinegar, one will say barbecue. So I could split this off and say barbecue, if that makes it easier to understand. Would this be a direct or indirect cost to the barbecue chips? It's right, this one is direct, right, and this one is direct over here, right? Because you can trace it directly. If I didn't make this product, I wouldn't have barbecue packaging. Okay, what is it to the chip factory? Direct, right? If I didn't have the chip factory, I wouldn't have that. Okay. And then to assembly line workers too, right? I can have specific, they're working on the barbecue or they're working on the salt and vinegar, right? So if they're working on barbecue, right, these are just my two different types. If they're working on barbecue, how does that relate to my barbecue chips? What? What did I hear? Direct, right? And this one, how does that relate to salt and vinegar? Right, this one is direct. Does that make sense? And then to the factory. Direct, good, okay. Is there ever a time when what?
When it's not going to be direct.
Yeah, I'm sure I could come up with a cost that's not direct to chip factory.
What would it be?
I'm trying to think of one. Okay, so it could be, let's say they have a chip factory and a cookie factory, and they have a factory division manager, right? It would be indirect, because if they got rid of the chip factory, he would still be, or she would be over the cookie factory. Okay? Okay. So let's look at another example here, if you turn your page over. So here we're going to look at a hospital, and they want us to determine if each of these costs is a direct or indirect cost, depending on the cost object, okay? So I'm just going to, I can see that they're looking at patients and a department, and so I'm just going to make a little picture down here. I'm just going to write patient A, patient B, patient C. And I'm going to put pediatric department. And I'm going to put the ER department. And these all fall under the hospital. Okay, so we're going to determine if each of these costs is a direct or indirect cost relative to a specific cost object. Okay. So the first one is the wage of the pediatric nurse relative to the pediatric department. Direct, right? If I got rid of the pediatric department, I wouldn't have the wage of that nurse, right? So that's direct. What if I asked you the wages of the pediatric nurse relative to patient A? This is my cost object. Would that be direct or indirect?
Indirect.
Yeah, so for number one, if the wage of the pediatric nurse relative to patient A, is that a direct or indirect cost? Indirect, right? Because it's going to be shared among whoever's in the pediatrics department. What about relative to the hospital? Direct, right? So if something is indirect here, it can move up to direct, right? It's not, it wouldn't go the other way. Like you wouldn't have direct here and indirect there. How about the second one, prescription drugs relative to a particular patient? Direct, right? Because prescriptions are made out to a certain person.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, right. Everybody good? What about heating the hospital relative to the pediatric department? Indirect, right? Because if I got rid of the pediatric department, would I still have to heat the hospital? Yeah. What? Question? Yes. So heating the hospital, is that direct or indirect relative to the pediatric department? Indirect, right? Because remember that heating of the hospital, we have to heat the whole hospital, right? So if I don't have the pediatric department, I still have to heat up the ER department. So the cost is shared. Okay, so that's indirect. Okay. What about the salary of the head of pediatrics? Relative, right, you have to remember which cost object are we looking at? The pediatric department. So what is it? Direct, right? If I didn't have the pediatric department, I wouldn't have the head of pediatrics. Yep. How about the salary of the head of pediatrics relative to patient B? Indirect, right? Because that would be shared amongst all patients in pediatrics. What about this one relative to the whole hospital? Number 4. Yeah, no, relative to the hospital. So the salary of the head of pediatrics relative to the hospital.
If we don't have the hospitals, we don't have the cost.
Right. Is everybody good on that one? It would be direct, right? If we don't have a hospital, we don't have any of these costs. Right, so all these costs are direct to the hospital. Okay. Where are we? Okay, so the salary of the head of pediatrics relative to this one, I think you already told me. Indirect, right? Good. The hospital chaplain salary, like a minister, relative to a particular patient. Indirect, right? Because it's shared. How about relative to the pediatric department, that same one? Still indirect, right? What about the hospital chaplain relative to the whole hospital? Direct, right? Good. And I'm actually going to skip these last two because I think that they're confusing. Okay. Because it's not clear if the lab tests, I don't know how hospitals do lab tests, like if they group them, batch them, so we're just going to ignore that. Okay. Okay, is everybody sort of on board? Everybody good? Okay, so let's talk about the context in which we're going to talk about costs. So, right, there are manufacturing and non-manufacturing costs, but I want to make sure that you understand the difference between merchandising and manufacturing companies. Can you guys come up with examples of merchandising companies? That's a company that sells someone else's product, right? They don't make anything. Amazon? I don't think Amazon makes their own product.
They do make some, but the majority of their products.
I think it's kind of like a Costco thing where it's like a Kirkland brand, they sell everyone else's stuff.
No, there's no Amazon brand.
Well, there's Amazon Basics, so they're buying it from somebody
Yeah,
else.
but that Amazon Basics is just stuff that they recommend that you buy.
Yeah, but it's packaged as Amazon Basics.
It is a brand, but
But
they
it's-
just take stuff from other, they take like the high street and stuff, and they're like, we're gonna make this on our own, but they still buy it from somebody else. They don't produce it.
I've never bought anything like the actual product has Amazon on it. It's just like the box with Amazon on it.
No, it does, because I buy Amazon Basic batteries, and it says Amazon Basic.
There's a label on it, but it's.
At other merchandising companies? What's your favorite merchandising?
Big sporting goods.
Sporting goods? They don't make anything, right? Your favorite, what's your favorite store? That's kind of a mix, right? Because they sort of make their own.
Well, but they make food at the restaurant.
Yeah.
Exactly. They have their own.
Get the food.
They take sort of raw materials.
No,
and
they
make-
don't slaughter the cows outside of steakhouse.
How do you know?
Any other? Okay, how about manufacturing companies? What examples?
Nike.
Nike, assuming they
Really
make their
any
own
brand.
stuff. Huh?
Those brands, like Nike, Adidas, Under Armour.
Yeah,
I'm
like
not 100% sure they actually make their own stuff.
who?
Any of those companies.
Of course they do.
You don't think they third party out under that stuff?
Nike?
Yeah, you don't think?
Nike has their own factories, yeah. Nike makes
Yeah,
it.
because they have all of them.
Yeah.
The auto industries, like General Motors or Ford, they do outsource.
Yeah, they both outsource. Yeah. Same with Apple, right? They outsource a ton of their stuff, but they do some of it themselves. So I just want to make sure you understand the difference. And the one that, which one do you think is more complicated? Someone that resells somebody else's stuff or makes your own stuff?
Resell.
Resell.
So much cheaper.
No, which one is more complicated?
It's complicated?
Sell
Yeah.
someone else's stuff. Yeah.
Complicated.
Which one's, like, which one do you think we have to keep track of the cost more? Right, no.
Merchandising.
So this is super easy, right? If I bought this pen for $1 and I sell it for $2, I know it cost me $1. If I built this pen, right, there's all sorts of pieces. So this is where it's more complicated, and this is what we're gonna focus on, of course. We're not gonna deal with it.
Well, what if the other people make your product really poorly, and then you have to sell poor products because you didn't make it yourself and we're not sure that it's quality.
And when we get sort of the end of the semester, we will talk about that.
All right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Crazy.
Okay, so our focus is gonna be on manufacturing companies. Okay? Okay, but manufacturing companies are gonna have both manufacturing costs and non-manufacturing costs. Okay, and so we've already talked about manufacturing costs with regard to the with regard to the potato chips. And we break these down into 3 categories. Okay, so we have direct materials, and so these are the materials that are easily traced into the production process, right? So what examples did we have from the chip example? What would be the direct materials there? Seasoning, potatoes, good. Oil, good. Packaging, good. Okay, those are direct materials. Then we have direct labor. And so these are the people that we talked about, the assembly line workers who directly touch the product, okay? And this is also going to be easily traced into the product. And the reason why this is easily traced is because we sort of assume that those are hourly workers and they do a time card and we know like what job they're working on. So we know, that person makes 15 bucks an hour and they worked on this potato chip for 10 hours. So we can directly trace those costs into the product, okay? And then last but not least, we have all the other indirect manufacturing costs. So this is everything else related to manufacturing that isn't direct materials or direct labor. So I'm going to start abbreviating these as DM and DL because we will be using them so often. Okay. So what are some examples from the potato chip factory that would be indirect manufacturing costs? Transportation. Mm-hmm. Factory electricity. I'm going to give you some others. So factory rent, factory depreciation of that machinery that they had. I'm also going to put on here factory supervisor. Okay. Right, because these are all costs that would be shared among multiple products, right? They're not direct costs to a particular product, they're shared. And hopefully you see a pattern here. Most of this, factory, factory, factory. Anything that you see that says factory is a manufacturing cost, obviously, right? Because it's in the factories where we manufacture stuff. And if it's not a direct material or direct labor, then it's this. And the term that we use for this is manufacturing overhead. So it makes sense. Overhead is everything else that we have to pay for. And we're going to start abbreviating that with MOH.
What is it for? What does it mean?
Manufacturing overhead. Right, here's the O, here's the H.
I'm not talking about, what is it? You said it's everything else, what?
It's everything else that's a manufacturing cost. So everything else that's related to the factory that isn't direct materials or direct labor. Okay. Question, everybody good? Okay. Then, right, obviously, then they're also going to have non-manufacturing costs, and we break those down into two. We have administrative and selling. So these are our non-manufacturing costs. So where do you think salespeople commissions would go? So salespeople commissions. How about accounting? Legal HR, right, that's all over here. It's not related to the manufacturing. How about advertising? Good. How about CEO salary? Yeah. Good. Everybody feel okay? Okay, so let's kind of test what we've learned. So if we turn the page, here's another exercise. Okay, so we are a custom computer company. Right? We make computers from components supplied by various manufacturers. The company is very small, and the assembly shop and the retail store are in the same facility. And then here are some of the costs. For each cost, indicate whether it's more likely to be direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead, or selling or administrative, right? So one of those 5 costs that we just talked about. So the cost of a hard drive installed in a computer, Maxie. Direct materials, right? You can directly trace that hard drive into the finished product.
Wait, I have a question. What about like the labor that goes into installing that?
That would be direct labor. Right? That would be like on the assembly line, or in this case, it might not be an assembly line. Whoever's touching the materials, that's direct materials.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. What about the cost of advertising? Selling. Gabe, here's number 3. The wages of employees who assemble the computers. DL, yeah, direct labor, good. Sales commissions. The salary of the assembly shop supervisor. Okay. Yeah, where does the assembly shop supervisor work? In the assembly shops. And if they're not touching the product, which we assume supervisors do not, then it is MOH, right? Manufacturing overhead. Does that make sense? That's what's called indirect labor. They're not directly touching the product, so it's not direct labor. Is everybody good with that one? Okay. The salary of the company's accountant? It's non-manufacturing. Which one? Administrative, good. What about depreciation on the equipment? Yep, so, and what are those called? The indirect manufacturing costs? MOH, yep, good. What about the rent on the facility? Good.
Even if it's also an office building?
You would split it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, question?
Can you just explain the difference between 6 and 5?
Okay, so the assembly shop is basically the factory. That's where they put stuff together. So that's manufacturing.
Okay.
Whereas the accountant has nothing to do with putting stuff together. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. We good? So the next part is I don't want to deal with until after you take your exam. So that's all we're going to cover today for chapter 1. Okay? So I hope you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you Monday for the exam. You're going to bring a pencil, right, or a pen, and I will bring the calculators. Question?
I'm sorry, I want to hear this.
Oh, huh? Oh. Oh, no, I was just saying, you're going to bring a pencil, and I will bring the calculator.